The Great Stock Exchange Fraud of 1814 remains one of the most notorious financial scandals in British history. At the heart of the case was Lord Thomas Cochrane, a distinguished naval officer and politician who was accused of being part of a conspiracy to manipulate the stock market. The case significantly impacted his career and personal life, and it sparked debates about justice and fairness in 19th century Britain. The stock exchange fraud took place against the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars, a time when Britain's political and economic environment was tense. In 1814, after years of intense military conflict, Europe was watching the movements of Napoleon Bonaparte closely. Any news concerning his military situation had the power to drastically affect markets, particularly the value of government bonds. It was in this volatile environment that the fraud was conceived. On February 21, 1814, the stock market in London was thrown into chaos by a false report claiming that Napoleon had been killed and that peace between Britain and France was imminent. The report suggested that a restoration of peace would soon occur, leading to a sharp increase in the value of government bonds. The announcement, however, was a carefully orchestrated hoax designed to manipulate the stock market for personal gain. At the center of this plot was a man named Charles Random de Berenger, who dressed as a French officer and arrived in Dover with fabricated news of Napoleon's defeat. His message spread rapidly, reaching the stock market and causing investors to react impulsively. Shares soared before the truth emerged, leaving many financially devastated and stock prices suddenly plummeting. Those behind the plot were able to buy stocks at low prices before the market correction, making a considerable profit. Lord Thomas Cochrane, the 10th Earl of Dundonald, was one of Britain's most celebrated naval commanders at the time of the fraud. Known for his naval brilliance and daring exploits, Cochrane had earned a reputation for being fearless and unconventional in his military strategies. However, his boldness on the battlefield did not endear him to everyone, and he had many political and personal enemies who were eager to see him fall from grace. When the stock exchange fraud came to light, Cochrane found himself implicated. The accusation against Cochrane was that he had knowingly conspired with de Berenger and other individuals to profit from the stock manipulation scheme. Specifically, it was alleged that de Berenger had fled to Cochrane's residence in London after disseminating the false report, and that Cochrane had helped him escape. Furthermore, it was claimed that Cochrane had purchased government bonds before the hoax became public, profiting from the sudden spike in prices caused by the fraudulent news. Cochrane, however, vehemently denied these allegations. He maintained that his connection to de Berenger was purely coincidental. According to Cochrane, he had offered de Berenger, whom he claimed to have known casually, a ride into London when the man unexpectedly arrived at his home. Cochrane stated that he had no prior knowledge of the fraudulent scheme and that his stock purchases were part of normal trading activity, unrelated to any inside information. Nevertheless, the circumstantial evidence against him was compelling enough to bring him to trial. The trial of Thomas Cochrane began in June 1814 and was widely followed by the British public. Cochrane's fame as a war hero made the trial particularly sensational, and many saw it as a test of whether justice could be applied equally to the powerful and the common citizen. Cochrane's defense team argued that he had no knowledge of de Berenger's fraudulent activities and that his actions were entirely innocent. However, the prosecution painted a different picture, portraying Cochrane as a man who had leveraged his privileged position for financial gain. The evidence presented by the prosecution focused heavily on the fact that de Berenger had visited Cochrane's home in suspicious circumstances, implying that Cochrane must have known about the scheme. Additionally, Cochrane's timely stock purchases raised suspicions that he had acted on inside information, benefiting from the temporary rise in bond prices. Despite Cochrane's protestations of innocence, the court found him guilty. He was sentenced to a year in prison, a fine of £1,000, and the loss of his naval rank. Perhaps even more damaging than the prison sentence was the loss of his knighthood and expulsion from Parliament. This was a severe blow to his reputation and career, as he had been a rising political figure and a national hero. The conviction was met with a mixture of shock and skepticism, with many of Cochrane's supporters believing that he had been wrongfully convicted. Some argued that the trial had been politically motivated and that Cochrane's outspoken views on naval reform and corruption within the government had made him enemies who sought to destroy him. Nonetheless, the court's decision stood, and Cochrane was left to face the consequences. Following his conviction, Thomas Cochrane embarked on a long and arduous battle to clear his name and restore his honour. Even while imprisoned, Cochrane continued to protest his innocence, insisting that he had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. His supporters, including his family and friends, rallied around him, and a campaign to overturn his conviction gained momentum. Upon his release from prison, Cochrane resumed his naval career, serving in the Chilean and Brazilian navies, where he achieved further military success. His reputation as a brilliant naval commander remained intact internationally, despite the stain on his name in Britain. Nevertheless, Cochrane remained determined to clear his record at home. Over the years, Cochrane lobbied tirelessly for a retrial, arguing that the evidence against him had been flawed and that he had been unfairly convicted. He presented new evidence and pointed to inconsistencies in the original trial, but for decades his efforts were largely unsuccessful. It was not until 1832, nearly 2 decades after his conviction, that Cochrane received a partial vindication. In that year, Cochrane was formally reinstated to the Royal Navy and restored to his rank. He was also re-elected to Parliament and received a royal pardon from King William IV. While the pardon did not amount to an official admission of his innocence, it was a symbolic victory for Cochrane, who saw it as a recognition of his unjust treatment. Despite the pardon, Cochrane continued to campaign for a full exoneration, as he remained convinced that he had been the target of a political vendetta. He wrote extensively about the case, publishing a book in which he detailed the events of the fraud and his trial, and he continued to assert that he had been wrongfully accused. Though he never achieved a complete exoneration in his lifetime, his persistence paid off in the long term. The Great Stock Exchange fraud of 1814 was a dramatic episode in British history, marked by scandal, intrigue, and the fall of a national hero. Thomas Cochrane's involvement in the case, whether justified or not, brought his brilliant naval career to a temporary halt and tarnished his public image. His conviction and subsequent efforts to clear his name highlight the challenges of seeking justice in an era where political motivations could easily influence legal outcomes. Cochrane's story is ultimately one of resilience and determination. Though he faced significant setbacks, he never gave up on his quest to restore his reputation. His eventual reinstatement and royal pardon, though not a full vindication, symbolized a partial recognition of his claims. Today, Cochrane is remembered not just for his military prowess, but also for his tenacity in fighting to clear his name, making him a complex and enduring figure in British history.